Caesar 3 was probably my favorite game as a kid. It came out in September 1998, after two predecessors in 92 and 95. It is a city building game set in ancient Rome, where you have to build cities meeting certain criteria and then defend them against Rome's enemies. While Caesar 1 and Caesar 2 were pretty similar to other city building games of the early 90s, everyone who played Caesar 3 will agree with me that its gameplay is really unique. In fact, the game can be pretty frustrating when you first start playing it, as it is actually quite complex. So in today's video we want to look at the historic context used in Caesar 3 and how accurately ancient Roman history is portrayed in the game. If you like our video game related history content or history content in general, we'd be thrilled by your like and subscription. Every interaction helps our young channel against the almighty algorithm. The way the game works is that you can't actually build houses for your citizens. Instead, you simply give them plots of land and they will build richer and bigger houses depending on how well you equip them with goods and services. You have to start by giving them drinking water and food, and then proceed to give them religious services, education, entertainment, bathhouses, pottery, furniture, then even more entertainment, barbers, oil, wine, oracles, hospitals, until finally they evolve into villas and rich work-shy patricians kick the hard-working plebeians out of their overcrowded houses. When providing your citizens with all these goods and services, unlike other classic city builder games, it is not sufficient to put the corresponding buildings in the vicinity of your houses. Rather, Caesar 3 uses something that has been referred to as the walker system. Each building spawns a walker, who will then randomly go around the streets you have built. Once the walker passes a house, the citizens in the house will be provided with the service of the building. So it is absolutely crucial in this game that you think well and hard about the setup of your streets, giving the walkers as little choice as possible where to go. The most typical setups are in fact small loops, so that no matter where the walker goes, they will eventually pass the house that you want them to pass. Although not actually historically relevant, this is a kind of fun interpretation of the famous saying of how all roads lead to Rome, and of the importance of roads in Roman history in general. In addition to the service-providing walker, there is also the so-called employment walker, who is labeled as a normal citizen. They too walk a certain distance in a random direction until they walk past a house that can provide the building with the necessary employees. So it is even more important to set up your roads to efficiently connect your residential areas, your industry, and your services. Another thing that makes Caesar 3 really fun yet hard to play are the complex employment rates that are being influenced not only by the total number of citizens in your city, but also, infamously, by your city's changing demographics. Often, when building a city in Caesar 3 and then taking too long to fulfill your quest, your aging population will be a serious problem, leading to a lack of overall workers. On the other hand, if your city grows too quickly, attracting mainly young adults as immigrants, the resulting high unemployment will lead to unhappiness and riots. Finally, while having to consider all these factors to build a successful and prosperous city, it is an additional struggle to keep your finances in order and to build up a garrison that can defend your city against attackers. But that amazing feeling when you finally manage to sell the goods in your warehouses to make enough money, or when you manage to turn a building block into freaking private palaces, is so addictive that the game is worth all the difficulties. So even if you have never played this game before, after all these years I can still recommend trying it out. Having repeatedly praised Caesar 3 for its original and complex gameplay, it is now time to assess the game's historical accuracy. First of all, the way they managed to portray Rome's hierarchical class structure works really well in my opinion. The patricians living in villas or palaces, and the plebeians' dwellings, ranging from crude tents to reasonably livable apartment blocks, illustrate the large social diversity in ancient Roman society. It's just a bit odd that the best plebeian housing, the Grand Insula, turns into a small villa that is housing patricians when you evolve it. That almost implies a degree of social mobility that simply didn't exist in that way. But honestly, I like the system of housing only being influenced by the player indirectly so much that I would never even change that mechanic. In Caesar 4 they actually did that, allowing you to only evolve a plebeian house into a better plebeian house, or a patrician house into an even better patrician house, but honestly that would worsen Caesar 3 so much. I just think it is really amazing that your citizens decide for themselves what kind of house they want to build in your city. While your citizens have a lot of agency when it comes to their housing, they absolutely lack it when it comes to the labor market. For some reason, you have to pay the plebeians working in your city, as if a Roman city had some sort of state ownership. That was definitely not the case, and while defining ancient Rome as capitalist in the modern sense of the word would be misleading and anachronistic, they did essentially have a free market. British historical sociologist Gary Runciman phrases it as follows. Rome, during the last 2 centuries of the Republic and the first 2 of the Principate, was an unequivocally capitalist society in the sense that it was based on the private ownership of property and the transaction of social relations through the market. What wasn't free in Rome's economy, though, was the life of slaves. As the Roman Empire had to feed a large urban population, a huge part of its economy was agricultural and industrial slave labor. Slaves were usually the military and civilian prisoners taken in Rome's successful military campaigns, and they were then sold on to rich farmers and aristocrats. Somehow understandably, Caesar 3 does not work with slave labor, although it is actually mentioned in the intro of the game. I also want to talk about the fact that in the game, Caesar repeatedly increases and decreases wages and the prices of goods. While there were some attempts to achieve price stability through imperial decrees, this was only done to curb the massive inflation that regularly plagued the Roman Empire, especially in its later stages. Because the Roman state was actually quite detached from the economy, often the only possibility for emperors to fund their wars and building projects was by minting new coins. And as they regularly did that, inflation became a real problem in the empire. So that weird increasing and decreasing of prices in the game does not really make sense. If anything, prices would consistently increase throughout the centuries. I am aware that factoring in inflation in addition to all the other things the game demands would be crazy though, so yeah, fair enough. Leaving the story of the game aside, I guess most of the inaccuracies of the gameplay and the mechanics of Caesar 3 are of an economic nature. Thus, they are understandably methods to keep this already complex game playable. But there is another category of inaccuracies that are a lot easier to criticize, and those lie in the campaign of Caesar 3. While the sandbox-style city construction kit offers a couple of interesting maps, the real deal in terms of cool scenarios in Caesar 3 come in form of the campaign mode. After the initial tutorial, players are offered a choice at the beginning of every campaign. The player can choose to play a military campaign, which involves invasions, or a peaceful one without. The peaceful campaigns come with their own set of challenges ranging from earthquakes to fires, and they generally require stats that are a lot higher than in the military ones. Probably my favorite peaceful mission is Lugdunum, in which you have to build a city at the site of modern-day Lyon. Lugdunum, or Lyon, lies at the confluence of the rivers Rhône and Saône, and even today the resulting peninsula is a landmark of Lyon. This river network, as well as the mountainous terrain in this area, is very prominent in Caesar 3's mission of Lugdunum. In the mission, you have to more or less integrate an existing Gallic settlement into your new Roman city. The best way to do this is to start your city across the river from the settlement, then gradually work your way towards the Gauls and up the fertile hills to feed a bigger city. Then, finally, you have to build a patrician neighborhood to reach your prosperity goals, which can be put on yet another little peninsula in the river, even further away from the original settlement. So you end up with a city that is pretty stretched out due to the terrain, the rivers and the Gallic settlement, but if you do it right, it is definitely possible to make this into a well-functioning and prosperous city. The big problem that I have with this mission in terms of historical accuracy is the starting date. So you start building the city in 170 BC, even though historical records show that the Roman Senate ordered the creation of a settlement at the site over a century later in 43 BC. There are similar timeline flaws with many of the other missions. Miletus came under Roman control in 133 BC, while the game sets it at 220 BC. Tarsus in 67 BC, while the game says 120 BC, and the Syracuse mission is set in 270 BC, although the Romans didn't even set foot on Sicily before the First Punic War in the 260s BC, and Syracuse itself remained in Greek hands until the Second Punic War in 212 BC. Speaking of which, the Punic Wars prominently feature in the campaign mode of Caesar 3. While they only indirectly play a role in the Syracuse mission, the Mediolanum mission is even called the Punic Wars. In Mediolanum, you have to build a city at the modern-day site of Milan. The timeline here is pretty good actually, with a start date of 220 BC, since the Romans conquered this part of northern Italy in 221 BC. And what is also pretty accurate is that in the 2 decades after 220 BC, freaking elephants crossed the Alps and must have passed through this area. They first came with Hannibal's invasion in 218 BC and then with his brother Hasdrubal in 207 BC. In this epic military mission, you have to build quite a big city and defend it against probably the strongest enemy force you will see in the entire game, despite this mission being a rather early one. You can do this by maxing out on the amount of legionaries and javelins you can have, train them at a military academy, and then additionally lock up your city with walls and towers to hold off the elephants that will eventually come to attack you. Once you have set up your defenses, which is surely the biggest challenge of this mission, you'll simply have to build a huge city behind those walls and cliffs. Of course, this mission also has its historical problems. Just as the mission afterwards, which is set in Carthage proper, supposedly after the Romans conquered it in the Third Punic War. I think a city building game can only go thus far at realistic depiction of ancient history, and we think it is amazing it features the Punic War so prominently. However, that should not stop us from further scrutiny on actual historical events. And because of that, our next few videos will not be about video games, but rather on the history and historiography of the Punic Wars. We'd love for you to rejoin for those future videos. So if you are interested in hearing more about ancient Roman history, we once again invite you to subscribe to our channel. Hopefully see you soon.
If you want to know what cities look like when they burn, watch carefully. If you want to know what cities look like when they burn, watch carefully. If you want to know what cities look like when they burn, watch carefully.